Hello again. Welcome back to our continuing discourse on good clinical practices. And this is session 2. We're going to get right into it. We are discussing definitions of the good clinical practices terms. These are terms that, as a clinical researcher, you want to be familiar with and understand what the effects are. The first term is an adverse drug reaction, or an ADR. In the pre-approval clinical experience with a new medicinal product or its new usages, particularly as the therapeutic doses may not be established, all noxious and unintended responses to a medical product related to any dose should be considered adverse drug reactions. The phrase responses to a medicinal product means that a causal relationship between a medicinal product and an adverse event is at least a reasonable possibility, i.e., the relationship cannot be ruled out. In simple terms, if there is a product or drug that is being tested and the patient develops an adverse event, which will be defined in the next term, they have a reaction to it. An adverse drug reaction means that there is a high probability that this adverse event or side effect came from the consumption of that product. That's what an adverse drug reaction is. Now, an adverse event is slightly different. An adverse event refers to any side effect that this patient experienced while on a clinical trial. So it's any untoward medical occurrence in a patient or clinical investigation subject administered a pharmaceutical product which does not necessarily have a causal relationship with this treatment. Remember, in adverse drug reaction, there's a high probability that there's a causal relationship, right? But in this one, it doesn't necessarily need to have it. An AE or adverse event, therefore, can be unfavorable and unintended. It can be an unfavorable or an unintended sign, including abnormal laboratory findings, and that means it could be a sign, it could be a symptom, it could be a disease temporarily associated with the use of the product, whether or not it is related to the product or not. In clinical trials, adverse events are one of the most important data in our trials. So we're studying a product to see, if it is efficacious, and so obviously, we want to minimize the adverse events, right? And we want to make sure that the adverse event really has no causal relationship to the product that is being studied. There are various ways that we capture events. They are graded in a certain way. But the big takeaway is that whatever the patient experiences in a clinical trial, you have to document it as an adverse event. And there are many ways of categorizing it. In certain protocols, if a patient has a history of certain like headaches and stuff, and they get a headache during the clinical trial, that will not be captured because they have that history. But if it exacerbates, then you capture that. But just know that a patient in a clinical trial, they take the product, they go out and they stub their toe, maybe on a tree or something, and then they come back to the clinic and they say, what happened? Yeah, I stubbed my toe. You have to capture it as an adverse event because it doesn't matter whether it's related to the product that is being studied or not. So that's it. Okay, I hope you understand the difference between an ADR and an AE. The next definition is the applicable regulatory requirements. So these are any laws or regulations addressing the conduct of clinical trials or investigational products, like the ICH GCPs, right? This is what we're currently studying, and this is a law that applies to clinical trials. Approval from an IRB or an ethics committee. I had mentioned this during our intro on the guidelines of ICH GCPs, and this is defined as an affirmative decision of the IRB that the clinical trial has been reviewed and may be conducted at the institution site within the constraints set forth by the IRB. The institution, good clinical practice, and applicable regulatory requirements. So a favorable approval means that they've studied all the documents, they looked at the protocol, they've said, oh, this facility is qualified and they can proceed with conducting this clinical trial. And in addition to that, there's oversight. There are certain things that have to be reported to them at specific periods. So audits are huge in clinical trials. If you are in clinical research, there are all types of audits. There are audits of sites, audits of IRBs, audits of the sponsor, audits of systems. It's a constant process in clinical trials that is actually implemented in every aspect of a clinical research project. So just be aware that it's something that is always ongoing, and it is defined as a systematic and independent examination of trial-related activities and documents to determine whether the evaluated trial-related activities were conducted and the data was recorded, analyzed, and accurately reported according to the protocol, sponsors, SOPs, and GCPs and regulatory requirements. So it's an added level of oversight to ensure that things are actually being conducted according to the protocol, SOPs and GCPs. And like I said, if you're a clinical research side, there can be a sponsor audit, which is the audit of the sponsor that has the trial. Your side, it could be, if you're dealing with a clinical research organization, they could come and have an audit as well. And they can sometimes audit just one aspect of the trial, several aspects of the clinical trial. And then it starts going up. You have the site audit, you have audit of the sponsor's records. They're just different layers of audits, and these are all to ensure that everything is going according to plan. And the ultimate clinical research toolbox also came from the findings that we got from various global audits, right? And so just make peace with audits. They're great. The findings actually help us understand better ways to ensure that patients are safe. An audit certificate typically gets issued after the audit has taken place. It's just a way to document, to say, okay, it's issued. It's a declaration of confirmation by the auditor that the audit has taken place. An audit report is a written evaluation of the sponsor's audit at the result, or the sponsor's audit of the results of the audit. Now, there are also follow-up actions involved. Now, in my experience, my job typically is to ensure that when we run a global audit, that the report actually reflects what has actually gone on. And then we have to gather all that data and look at what the findings, what the trends are. We have to follow up with the clinical research sites, ensure that if there are any findings that can be implemented, that is done, right? And then we use that information to create additional training for clinical research sites and also personnel, right? That's really what it is. Now, and every audit is a whole different ballgame. I mean, it's it's an audit that comes with its own findings, its own report. So just look at it as the audit report is really there to give you a basis for the audit. This is what happened. These are the findings, and these are the things that you have to work on. So an audit trail in clinical trials is documentation that allows reconstruction of the course of events, and it's written and electronic. The audit trail happens in so many different ways. So on your source documents at the clinical research site, whatever you're using to capture the initial data from the procedures that you're conducting, there is a certain way that you have to make corrections. You can't use, you can't blank anything out with white out. You can't just scribble through stuff. There's a way you have to line through initial, you have to date. That's an audit trail to show that we know that this is the correction that was made, and there's a reason for why that correction was made, and we can actually follow up the rationale for it, right? So that's one thing. And this happens across all paper documents in clinical trials, whether at the level of the clinical research facility or at the sponsor company. Then there is the electronic form, which is more common now. If you're using an electronic database to capture information, that's the reason why only one person can log in, right? You use only your login to get the information, so we can know who's working on the data at what time. When corrections are made in the system, we can tell. So all systems that are used in clinical trials automatically have this audit trail interwoven into them. So let's move on to blinding and masking. So a procedure in which one or more parties to the trial are kept aware of the treatments. So that's what blinding and masking is. Now, single blinding refers to the subject being unaware. Double blinding refers to subjects and investigators and monitors, and in some cases, data analysts being unaware of the treatment assignments. The most common type of clinical trials are usually double-blinded trials, and they mean no one is aware. The investigator, the monitor, the pharmacist typically are not aware of the clinical trial. Now, in some cases, there There are clinical trial projects where nobody's aware of the treatment, but there was a separate team that actually manages that and really make sure that, those processes are implemented and they know what is going on. So just be aware that depending on the kind of trial that you are conducting, you absolutely want to make sure that this is implemented, that if it's a single blind, your subject should know, and that, throughout the course of the study. Now, throughout the course of the study, you should not be aware of what what is being studied, but you don't know if the patient is getting a placebo or they're getting the product or they're getting a similar product, right? But here's the thing. There is no alarm to be made, because I know several people have asked, but if nobody knows what they're taking, what if the subject gets a reaction? There is a whole process for unblinding in clinical trials, and that is actually implemented. So it's just a way of ensuring minimizing. So these are all systems to minimize bias in a clinical trial, right? So if I'm studying a new headache medication and then the patient, and I'm also, comparing it to maybe aspirin that's on the market or Panadol, right? And I know that I'm taking Panadol and aspirin. It might be a little bit bad, because I know when I take Panadol, my headaches go away, or I take aspirin, my headaches go away. So just little ways of ensuring that, the product actually works. So let's talk about a case report form. So it is a printed optical or electronic document. In that case, it's called an ECRF, an electronic case report form, designed to record all of the protocol required information to be reported to the sponsor on each trial subject. So these are databases, systems. When you're using on a paper study, you will get your case report form. So you document the information that is received from the patient when you conduct the procedures. Wherever you document that information initially, that's your source document. It could even be on a piece of toilet paper, for real. That is your source document, which you always have to keep. Then you now take that data and then you put it in this case report form. And modern clinical trials all use EDC, electronic data capture. There are few trials out there that still use paper studies, and they're typically very small trials or pilot projects, but they all use electronic CRF. So that's the standard right now in clinical trials. Now, a clinical trial study is what you're involved in. So we call it clinical trial study, a study, clinical trial. I mean, those are all different terms, but it is an investigation in human subjects intended to discover or verify the clinical, pharmacological, and or other pharmacodynamic effects of an investigational product, and to identify any adverse reactions to the investigational products, right? And or to study absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion of an investigational product with the object of ascertaining its safety or efficacy. The terms clinical trial and clinical study are synonymous. So that's it. That's what a clinical trial is, and those are the parameters that it is set up to monitor and conduct and manage and to report. So let's talk about a clinical trial study report, or it's known as a CSR. It's a written description of a clinical trial study of any therapeutic, prophylactic, or diagnostic agent conducted in human subjects, in which the clinical and statistical description, presentations, analysis are fully integrated into a single report. This comes at the end of a clinical trial. The CSR is put together by the sponsor company or whoever is managing this trial, and it's really a brief, it's a summary of the overall items of a clinical trial. There are patient narratives, there are narratives on adverse events, and that's really what it's there to document what has been going on during the clinical trial at a high level and based on the different clinical research sites and their data that is actually coming from there. So that's the end of session 2. I hope you understand these definitions. Again, I always say, always look at the definition, and if you're conducting clinical trials, see how that applies to your project and how you can actually implement that. And it is my hope that by the end of this, you have more clarity on the best ways to be successful at managing clinical trials or to be successful in a clinical research career. Thank you again for listening.